You are now listening to The Big Trade with Peter Pham, enlightening conversations for maximum market returns.
David, welcome to the Big Trade series. This has been something that we've been working on, setting up this call for quite some time. I know you have a lot of insight and perspective on all these free trade agreements, going back from like the first one all the way up to the TPP. I'd love for you to give an introduction of yourself and explain, kind of like what you've done over the last several years, because I know your background's very interesting as well.
Well, first of all, Peter, it's great to be on your show, and thanks for having me here today. Just by way of background, many years ago, I'm from Chicago, and I met this skinny young state senator in Illinois by the name of Barack Obama, and we became friendly. I worked some on his Senate campaign, and then I worked a lot on his presidential campaign. I went with him to Washington, spent the first year of his administration in Washington working in the White House, and then he was kind enough to appoint me the United States ambassador to Canada, where I served for 4 years. And after I left that position, I joined the Bank of Montreal, BMO, as the vice chairman, and our U.S. headquarters is here in Chicago, where I live, and I split my time between Canada and the United States and elsewhere around the world.
Well, that's excellent. I'd love to hear more about your interactions with Obama as well. That sounds like a very interesting story. Well, actually, one of the interesting things I've always known about him was his kind of like terrific rise to power, going from basically a grassroots movement all the way up to becoming the president of the United States, not necessarily going the conventional route. I don't know if you have any insight for anyone that's listening in about how something like that could be executed.
Well, it's one of those, I will say a couple things. First of all, when I met the now President Obama, you could have lunch with Barack Obama if you paid for lunch. The situation has obviously changed quite a bit over the years. The thing that was magical was the 2008 campaign. When I started in the campaign, which was in late 2006, I recall my first meeting, there were 4 people, there were 2 desks, 2 chairs, and 2 of us sat on the floor, and my only contribution to the meeting, as best I recall, is that I lost the campaign's only key to the men's room. But somehow or another we recovered from that, and he won the election, and he's been doing a great job ever since. I'm very proud of him and the things that his administration has done, and one of them obviously is TPP.
Yeah, that's an excellent segue. I know you have been involved a lot with the original formation of the TPP, but prior to that, perhaps you could give us some background about what you've done with other free trade agreements and how they came into fruition, and perhaps you can give like some behind the scenes look on what that was like.
Well, as the ambassador to Canada, one of the things that I dealt with literally on a daily basis were the benefits and occasionally the burdens of the prior regional trade agreement, the biggest regional trade agreement, the one that was referred to as Regional Trade Agreement 1.0, which is NAFTA, which is between, obviously, the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And at the highest level, that has been an agreement that, as I always say, it was good for Mexico, it was good for Canada, and it was very good for the United States. I'm more familiar with the Canada-U.S. portion of it than the Mexico portion, but trade, the two-way trade between our two countries, Canada and the United States, has tripled since NAFTA. It has created millions of jobs on both sides of the border, and one of the things maybe we can talk about as we go along, but jobs that involve export are typically good jobs. They are high-paying jobs. They're the kinds of jobs we want to create. And so this was really a boom to American consumers, to American workers, to the economy as a whole. And I saw that literally every day. There were some issues with NAFTA. And NAFTA was negotiated 25 years ago. It's just had its 20th anniversary, but there was a long period of negotiation. And many of the things that we take for granted today, for example, the internet, the information economy, they just didn't exist before. The importance of technology in our lives, the need for labor mobility. Some of these things just weren't as important then as they are now. And whether it is on the labor side, whether the environmental side, services. I'm in the banking industry now, and banking was not nearly as global then as it is now. And so there were just some holes in NAFTA. And there has been conversation over and over the years about whether there would be some sort of renegotiation of NAFTA to fill some of those holes. And in fact, I think a way to characterize it is events have overtaken that conversation because with Canada and Mexico and the United States part of TPP, many of these issues in NAFTA have been addressed. Not all, but many. And so in some real way, assuming everyone ratifies the agreement, we will have fixed many of the issues that people have complained about over the years. In terms of getting into the TPP discussions, I was very involved. Actually, Mexico and Canada got in toward the very end on successive days. There was a flurry of activity over the course of a few days, and then sometime thereafter Japan joined to really bring big economies into this thing. It started out as a very small exercise.
Right.
Among some very small countries, and indeed people used to make fun of it. What do we need a regional trade agreement with Brunei for? But it has grown dramatically as we've added large economies to it. And there was concern on both sides, as there always is in entering into these agreements, about are we going to get steamrolled? Are the Canadians going to make concessions on some of the things that are very important to the United States, or the Mexicans, or the Japanese? There are, in all these countries, so-called sacred cows. In Canada, it was literally sacred cows. So one of the big issues was dairy.
Right.
But we worked very hard for a very long time. Ron Kirk was the U.S. trade rep at the time, and Mike Froman was the person in the White House who was responsible for this, and Ambassador, they're now all ambassadors, Ambassador Kirk, Ambassador Froman, and me, worked very hard with our Canadian counterparts, and they worked very hard with their Mexican counterparts to get this in, and ultimately everyone decided, and I think very wise decision on everyone's part, everyone decided that it was best if we all got into this thing together, among other reasons, because it was a way to fix up NAFTA.
David, let me ask you a question in regards to one of these agreements. As you know, and I've seen this, and forgive me if I'm a little skeptical about all of this as well, is that I noticed that for big agreements, like free trade agreements like this, the public has only recently been able to review the 1,000-page document pertaining to all the details of the TPP. Why is it that for a big trade agreement like this, less information is actually disseminated, and most people are kind of like guessing, or I spent a lot of time in the Asia Pacific region, and we're kind of like just guessing about what the potential benefits are. Anyone, when we heard about the agreement being signed recently, a bunch of people, experts and specialists started to give their input, but the reality was no one really had access to any of the documentations pertaining to the TPP. So it was all a lot of guesswork. And I guess my question is, who's actually involved in the drafting of the agreement, and why is it that you think that the public doesn't get more transparency towards that until everything is signed and sealed?
Well, let me say, let me break my answer into two parts. First of all, the who. There are trade ministers in each country.
Right.
And the trade ministers and their staffs are the ones who negotiate this. And there are rounds of negotiation, and I don't know how many, but there were a lot of rounds of negotiation. Mm-hmm. And so what would happen is, periodically, every couple of months, typically, the staffs and or the ministers would, and at the beginning it was the staffs, would negotiate, would sit down, they would negotiate, they would talk about, for example, there would be a meeting on the labor chapter, and they would try to come to as much consensus as they could, understanding you've got a dozen countries and some have very different views. Vietnam, for example, has a very different labor system than the United States or Canada or Mexico. And so they would try to come to some consensus, and they would figure out what they could agree upon and what they couldn't agree upon. And that process was an iterative process. And then as you started to move further down the line, the trade ministers themselves in the United States, that's the U.S. Trade Representative, now Mike Croner, the ministers themselves, with guidance from their political leaders, the president in our case, would sit down and try to work out the hardest issues. And there's bargaining, there's horse trading. That's the nature of the deal, is horse trading. So that's the who, okay? Mm-hmm. The second question is, well, why is it secret? And I would say it wasn't secret, it just wasn't, the texts were not disclosed. But the answer is, as someone who has negotiated a lot of things over my lifetime, before I used to be a lawyer, negotiated a lot there, I've negotiated a lot when I was in the government, and now that I'm a banker, I negotiate a lot here. It doesn't work too well if you have to tell somebody who puts it in the newspaper what your ultimate positions are. Mm-hmm. That's not a very effective negotiating strategy. Mm-hmm. And so, by its nature, negotiation has to be, you can't put all your cards on the table or you're never going to win. Even Donald Trump would agree with that. But So that's why it works the way it works. But the third point, and I really think this is the most important part, there is now an opportunity. The full text of this agreement is available. It's 1,000 pages long. All of the side letters and side agreements are available to anyone who wants to read them. We are in the process of lots of people in lots of countries examining these very closely, that ultimately, under the Trade Promotion Authority that Congress granted to the President, the United States Congress is going to have a say, up or down, in whether or not to approve TPP, and they're going to do that based upon the input of large numbers of interest groups. And I can't speak to the process everywhere, but I know there is a similar process in Canada, and I suspect in most of the countries that are involved in TPP, not all but most, there is a similar process. So, this notion that somehow or another something is being done in the dark, I think, is unfair. That there was a negotiation, that by its nature, negotiation has to be done confidentially, but ultimately, countries have to approve this thing, and it's all out in the public, and anybody who wants to go on the internet, go to the U.S. Trade Reps website, and you can read anything you want.
Sure. Okay, so David, another thing is we haven't addressed another elephant in the room, which is China. And as you know, a lot of Asian countries are a part of this TPP agreement. How do you think, what do you think is the dynamics here in terms of China? Because China is definitely going to be doing a lot of trading with many of the countries around Asia and also many of the North American countries as well.
Peter, I think that perhaps the most important outcome of TPP, more important than any individual tariff that's reduced or intellectual property that's protected or anything else, is the fact that the free market economies, led, quite frankly, by the United States, but that the free market economies were able to define the rules of international trade in the Pacific region. And that if China wants to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I think everyone kind of expects they will, but certainly hopes they might, if they are going to join it, they're going to have to join it based upon the rules that were negotiated and are part of those 1,000 pages that I talked about before. And that is of enormous importance, that if the United States doesn't ratify TPP, then there is going to be some other agreement that the Chinese negotiate with some of these countries, and I can assure you it is not going to have any of the protections, or most of the protections, that we hold so dear. So I think as a strategic matter, as a geopolitical matter, as a broad-based economic matter, the fact that we were involved in setting the rules of the road with respect to international trade in the Pacific region is the most critical factor in TPP, and quite frankly, the most important reason why Congress should approve it.
And David, when I hear this, though, I'm also thinking about the arbitrage. I'm thinking almost as an entrepreneur here. I'm thinking about being here in Vietnam, being able to import raw materials from China and actually ship to the United States from Vietnam finished products in order to benefit from this trade agreement. Do you think that, do you see these things as opportunities as well for many Asian countries? Because some of them actually have a trade deficit with the United States. And I don't know if this is designed to kind of like mitigate or reduce China's trade with the United States and actually boost the rest of Southeast Asia's trade with the United States.
I would not characterize it as an effort to reduce trade with China at all. Trade with China will be what it will be. But what it will do is it will make it much easier for the countries within TPP to exchange goods and services. And that's why you negotiate. It is a two-way deal. You're absolutely right that, for example, Vietnamese goods will be easier to export into the United States and the other 11 TPP countries on the one hand, but conversely, it is going to be much easier for the United States to sell agricultural products in Vietnam, autos in Vietnam, the full range of services that we provide in Vietnam. And so this is beneficial to both sides. This is why trade is good. It is the theory of comparative advantage that I learned about when I was in college about 100 years ago.
Right.
That trade benefits all sides. I do believe that. I believe that fair trade, anyway, benefits all sides. And in TPP, we have really the most forward-leaning, far-reaching regional trade agreement ever. I referred earlier to the fact that NAFTA is referred to as Regional Trade Agreement 1.0, and my friends at the U.S. Trade Rep used to refer to their negotiations on TPP as Regional Trade Agreement 4.0. It was generations ahead. And by setting out fair rules of the road for all of the countries, I think that all of the countries are going to benefit. And, in the example you gave with Vietnamese goods that are being shipped to the United States, that's good for U.S. consumers. Another fact that people sometimes overlook in an area that I'm a little bit more familiar with, Canada, people used to always say, well, if Canadians ship more goods to other countries, is that bad for the United States? And the answer is absolutely not. For every dollar that Canada exports, every dollar of goods and services that Canada exports, 25% of that content, a quarter in every dollar, is U.S. content. Mm-hmm. So they sell a dollar's worth of goods to Vietnam, a quarter of that came from the United States in one way or another. In Mexico, it's a higher percentage. So this is why trade is good. People buy and sell things back across borders, and we're all better off because of it.
Right. And David, when I'm looking at this TPP agreement, I'm thinking about what then becomes a massive competitive advantage for countries that are trying to export a whole bunch of stuff to the United States, especially in Southeast Asia. And when I look at this, I actually take a look at the currencies now, and I look at all the members of the TPP, and I think it's pretty safe to say that all of these countries, through their own monetary policies, have actually seen devaluations of their currency relative to the US dollar. Some more than others, but most of them have actually declined quite a bit since, I don't know, let's just say since the year 2012, actually. Do you think that in order for some of these countries to get a leap, now that the TPP or potentially the TPP is going to go into effect, is that one of the countries would probably be strategically advantageous to continue to devalue their currency to add that extra basically kicker for anyone that was interested in importing their products? And then as a result, do you think that there's a whole thesis about currencies continuously basically going to zero based on this idea?
Well, first of all, the relationship among the price of currency is a very complicated question, and
Right.
I'm certainly not an expert in it. And clearly, at least some of our trading partners, the one that is mentioned most often is China, have made some effort to devalue their currency to make their exports cheaper elsewhere.
Right.
That's not a good thing. This race to the bottom is not good, it's not healthy, and in the long run, not healthy probably for the economies that do it.
Right.
Having said that, one of the things that TPP does is address this and make it harder for countries to devalue their currencies. And again, there's a complicated mechanism in place and a series of rules which I'm not expert in, but it does address that very point, which is something that Congress was concerned about.
Okay. Yeah, because when I'm looking at the parties here, I see like Australia, Japan, Malaysia, New Zealand, even the Canadian dollar, as you know, Singapore dollar, Vietnamese dong, they've all actually have depreciated. And one of the rationales, at least in Asia, that we're looking into, we're actually covering this as a thesis for another piece that we're doing is actually about the trade situation. And since commodities have declined so much and Asia is a massive exporter of commodities, then they got to look at other mechanisms to stay competitive with each other. And when you look at the renminbi, it's actually done the best out of a basket of Asian currencies over this period of time, even though it is also devaluing as well. So I don't know, like I'm sure you've heard of Donald Trump. He's been a very harsh critic of the TPP agreement. He's saying that the United States has gotten a very raw deal out of this. So I'm really wondering here how the details of the currency agreement like that and how that will restrict currency devaluations, especially if you believe in free markets. You want these currencies to have like basically free float rather than being on some kind of like trading ban or range set by the state or central banks here.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in Donald Trump's views on TPP or much else, but be that as, and I'm not sure I don't know whether he's thought it through or not, but his level of sophistication and discussion about these things leaves something to be desired. But we're not here to debate Donald Trump.
Right.
There are, as I said earlier, and I'm not an expert, but there are a lot of reasons that currencies go up and down.
Right.
And I think the most fundamental reason that currencies, whether in Asia or in Europe or anywhere else, have devalued against the dollar is because the U.S. economy is the strongest economy in the world at the moment. The dollar declined against those currencies in 2007, 8, 9. And because our economy has grown back, perhaps not in the way that some of us would like, but has grown better than the economy really anywhere else in the world in any real sense, that is the most fundamental reason that the dollar is appreciating and some of these other currencies are depreciating. But quite frankly, to get into the nuance of why one or another is depreciating more or less, I think you need to talk to an expert, and I'm not that guy.
Right. And in terms of, I'm sure there's going to be a whole bunch of protectionists that will be crying foul here. What do you think about the global labor dynamics of the TPP agreement, and what kind of effects could you imagine this having on the labor market globally?
Well, that's one of the really good things about TPP. It has the strongest worker protection provisions of any trade agreement in history. Okay, this is the largest expansion of labor rights in history. For example, every one of the TPP countries, every one of them, including some that basically have no rights for labor, have to meet the core standards of the International Labor Organization's declaration. Again, I'm not expert in what they all are, but they have to do it, and they have to do it in a way that is enforceable in the same way as everything else in TPP. That every one of these countries has to give freedom to trade unions to form and to collectively bargain. And there are countries like Vietnam, which we've talked about before, where such organizations have historically been banned. There are provisions against child labor and forced labor. There are requirements of living wages and safe working conditions. And particularly for U.S. workers who already have these benefits, that what happens here is it levels the playing field. It makes it easier for our workers who do get decent wages and who do have prohibitions against child labor and forced labor and who do have the rights to collectively bargain. It gives them a level playing field to compete against some of the workers in some of these other countries that do not have those rights. So, is it perfect? No, nothing's perfect. Is it something that over time can be improved upon? I'm sure it can. But this is a giant step forward in workers' rights around the world.
Right. And David, as we all know, that you work for a financial institution, a bank, actually.
Yep.
There's a lot of capital controls that are happening post 2007, 2008. There's going to be so much more restriction to the flow of capital. It seems as if the TPP agreement allows one to bypass that, but something like that requires a vast, sophisticated understanding of the details and nuances of the agreements. There are going to be people that are going to criticize and say that an agreement like this is designed strictly for plutocrats and technocrats that can understand the great details on how to leverage the benefits of something like this, primarily like corporations and thinking about how to structure multinational entities. What would you say to someone like that, even you admittedly not having read the 1,000-page document to be able to exploit potentially some of the advantages that could be hidden in the fine print?
Well, I'm not one of those technocrats, but let me say this. First of all, you can make that, call it populist argument against anything. The piece of legislation is 500 pages long. How somebody's supposed to read it? Well, that's just the nature of when you're trying to deal with a lot of issues. But let me say this to your point. There is, for the first time in a trade agreement, or a regional trade agreement anyway, a chapter dedicated specifically to small and medium-sized businesses. First time ever. And in the United States, about 5% of the small businesses and medium-sized businesses in the United States export anything. And when they look at the fact that 95% of the consumers in the world don't live in the United States, you got to say to yourself, there is a huge opportunity for growth. And what this chapter does is it makes it easier for small businesses to export. It lowers the taxes on their exports. One of the things we haven't talked about is that TPP reduces about 18,000 taxes that foreign countries put on U.S. goods. But it lowers those taxes. It reduces the paperwork that they have to fill out. It takes steps to deal with potential corruption in some of these countries. It reduces the red tape at customs. It reduces the restrictions on internet data flows. And fundamentally, it makes it cheaper, it makes it easier, it makes it faster for American small businesses to export their goods and services to the other TPP countries. So, I don't think it's fair to say that this is an agreement that only benefits big business. It only benefits ultra-sophisticated folks. That it is designed to help small businesses, mid-sized businesses, and most fundamentally, American workers.
Right. And as you know, David, I indicated to you that I'm currently here in Vietnam. It would be really interesting. I'm sure everyone will want to quote you on this after we complete this podcast and this story's featured on Forbes. Is what do you think the implications are with Vietnam? It's a country that obviously is a socialist state. We're actually going through an election. Actually, 50% of the world is going through some kind of general election as we speak, which is about 50% of the world's economy. Vietnam's recently signed with the WTO. That was in the early 90s and 2000s. Equity markets have opened up for the first time, but as you know, there's going to be a lot of state-owned enterprises. There's going to be restriction to foreign ownership towards assets and companies in a country like this, very similar to China and the rest of Asia. What are your thoughts here on Vietnam?
Well, I'm not the Vietnam expert, although my son did just visit there relatively recently and came back very impressed. But let me say this: in whether it is Vietnam or others of smaller countries that have a different financial system, a different governmental system, one of the things this does is it brings them closer. It's not going to make them into a U.S. or British or some other form of democracy, but it brings them closer to a system where hopefully the Vietnamese people will do better. I mean, the goal of this is, let me go back to something I said earlier, which is the benefit of NAFTA. NAFTA was good for Mexico, it was good for Canada, it was good for the United States. The goal of TPP is to be good for the people of Vietnam and the people of Japan and the people of Brunei and the people of Peru and the people of the other countries in TPP. And I do believe that if this agreement is ratified and we give it a chance, it is going to do that. Like any trade agreement, there are winners and losers. There will be some dislocation in every country as people adjust to some of these rules. If you have an industry that was protected historically and now it's open to trade, they have to become more competitive. But net, when you take all that into account and you look back now, for example, with NAFTA 20 years later, I suspect that what we are going to see is a dramatic increase in trade in this region. And it is going to raise the standard of living of people in all of the TPP countries.
Excellent. David, I want to put on my equities investor baseball cap on, because at the end of the day, this is an investment focus actually show. What opportunities or trends do you think exist? I know obviously some of them are very obvious, but maybe we can just try to state where you think some massive tidal wave of opportunities exists for an equity investor to capture this influx of movement of capital or velocity of money the world over.
Well, I'm probably not the guy to be picking stocks or even picking industries. But obviously, any business that has the potential for more export, and where the countries within TPP have been unfriendly to those exports, there's going to be growth. I mean, take one example that I am familiar with from all of this, the American dairy industry. The American dairy industry, and for that matter, the New Zealand and the Australian dairy industries, have very much wanted to export dairy products, cheese, milk, other products, to Canada. The Canadian market was very closed. There is a process, it won't be totally go away tomorrow, but there is a process for opening up the Canadian dairy market. And were I a dairy farmer, were I a U.S. cheese producer, were I someone in that industry, that's something I'd be looking for. Auto parts are going to be able to move more freely under these agreements. In some countries, I think that there is a tariff in some of the TPP countries as high as 70%.
100%, actually. We're talking in the hundreds. The tariffs in some places in Asia are in the hundreds as opposed to even 70%.
And so, you know, if you're a auto manufacturer, that's probably good news that those markets are going to be open to your goods. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities, and I think you're going to have to see how it plays its way through the system. But the first opportunity here is for the Congress of the United States of America to approve the agreement. And there is going to be a long process. There is going to be a drawn-out process. You will hear all kinds of complaints about this thing, some of them well thought through, some of them not well thought through, because, as I said, there are winners and losers in any trade agreement. The losers will think it's terrible, and the winners will think it's great. And hopefully our elected officials are going to look at the whole of the United States economy. But I think the next big set of issues, at least in my country, are going to be how does the Congress address this? When does the Congress address this? There is a process now for analysis of the benefits and the costs of TPP on the U.S. economy. That information will be made public. That information, presumably, the Congress will rely on, and hopefully, in the not terribly distant future, we will be able to say that the United States has ratified the agreement and we are part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Excellent. David, probably two more questions to cap this off. Perhaps you can tell us about what you're doing at the Bank of Montreal now.
I would be delighted. Finally something I know something about. I am the vice chairman of the bank. The Bank of Montreal is the 8th largest bank in North America. It was founded in Canada. We still have the bulk of our assets and income operations in Canada. We have a very large presence in the United States, which is growing. Our U.S. headquarters is here in Chicago, where I live and where I was from. And my job is basically in three areas. One is I am very much involved in managing the senior relationships of the institution, our clients, our customers, at all levels, in the investment banking side, and the wealth management side, the commercial banking side, retail banking side. I'm very much involved in that. I have some operational responsibilities at the bank, and the third category is, our CEO, Bill Dowd, likes to always talk about the fact that every one of our 50,000 employees is an ambassador for the bank. Comes a little easier for me, perhaps, than some, having been a U.S. ambassador. And so I'm involved in a variety of activities, some of them organizations and not-for-profit organizations, on a variety of boards. I speak, I talk to folks like you about what's going on in the world, and hopefully and shed some enlightenment on that and raise the profile of the institution. But it's been great, and I've been very lucky and very fortunate to land here. There's always, when you leave a high position of government service, There's always, people always think there's going to be a letdown or a disappointment, and people stop standing up when you walk in the room, and your jokes aren't quite as funny as they used to be. But I have been very, very fortunate in ending up here at BMO, and I look forward to a long and mutually productive relationship.
And publicly, from what's available public, is what is BMO's overall growth strategy that you could share with us?
Well, one of the things that I can tell you is that there are 5 big Canadian banks,
yep.
and that they dominate the banking scene in Canada. There are a lot more banks in the United States than there are in Canada, or economies. But there are 5 big Canadian banks, and each of them has a growth strategy outside of Canada, and they have to. And a large part of the growth strategy, not all, but a large part of the growth strategy of the Bank of Montreal, BMO, is to grow in the middle of the United States. That's why we're here in Chicago. And that over time, we have been and we will continue to grow. We made a very significant acquisition a few years ago of a bank that was headquartered in Milwaukee that very much increased the size of our footprint here, and hopefully as time goes on, we will continue to do things like that and continue to grow. Here in the middle of the United States, there are other parts to our growth strategy, but I think that's the one that is most relevant to the things I work on.
Excellent. And let's have one final question, and let's try to make it a fun one. Maybe perhaps you could share a really fun story about an interaction with President Obama, or maybe some other prime minister or something like that.
Well, let me. I don't know if I want to talk about my. Actually, I will tell you a good story about President Obama, but it involves my wife.
Sure.
The president came to Canada. I know the president, and my wife knows the president. And the president came to Canada for the G8 and G20 meetings in Toronto. And he lands at the airport, and my wife and I are standing at the bottom of the stairs at Air Force One, and the reporters are all around. And the president walks down the steps with Mrs. Obama, Michelle, and gets to the bottom of the steps, and I shake hands, and my wife is standing there, and he gives my wife a kiss. And my wife looks at him and says, "Mr. President, in Canada, we kiss on both cheeks." And he laughed, and she laughed, and I have a wonderful picture at home of the president kissing my wife on the second cheek, and everybody smiling and laughing. And he's a good guy and a great president, and I was very proud to be a part of this administration.
That shows a little bit of the European influence that Canada has by the double kiss, right?
You gotta remember where you are when you go to kiss someone.
Well, thank you very much, David. It's great having you on, giving some insight on TPP and what your bank is doing, and sharing some stories. Maybe we can do this sometime soon.
I would look forward to it. Thanks a lot, Peter.
Okay, thanks.
We hope you enjoyed this mastermind session. If you'd like to contact Peter Pham or Phoenix Capital, please email info@phx-cap.com.